we'll kick it off. Looks like we've got as many as we're going to get. So the panel we were told to talk to you about today, picked by Plowman, is why is sovereignty important? So I will pose that question to each one of the panelists here. I might dodge it myself as the moderator, but I did, as I explained, I do want to open up the questions to the audience without the tech. We will just ask you to raise your hands, and I will pass you a microphone if you have a question that you want to ask. That way, your voice can be recorded and put together on the content that they are creating here. So, why, Adam, is sovereignty important?
Sorry, I don't even have a mic.
There you go.
I don't really like this question. I don't know. Why is sovereignty important? I guess here's a way I can frame it that'll open up for maybe more interesting answers, more interesting questions too. That I'll rephrase the question ever so slightly to make it more interesting, which is why does it suck when you don't have sovereignty? Because I think that's a much more helpful way to even get into explaining Bitcoin to people. And actually, there was someone who came up and had a chat with me after my presentation, who was bemoaning. I'm just thinking if he's here. I don't think he's here. I could have just given the mic to him. But he was bemoaning how difficult he's found it trying to orange pill people. And obviously, I'm very sympathetic to this. I think probably everyone here, I expect everyone here is that you've had a similar experience to this with people that you think ought to get it, maybe because you figure they're smart, I suppose, or they should have had experiences that lead them to this. But a lot of people just don't seem to. And my kind of stoic response to this, I get, or what I think of as stoic, is I think it's own meme now, right? It's like everyone buys Bitcoin at the price they deserve. It's a little bit defeatist, I guess, but it is probably also just largely true. But so getting back to the question though, so why is sovereignty important, or my rephrasing of it, why does it suck when you don't have it? I think that's the reason I prefer that framing, because the only way I think I've really had any success with this is not even so much to extol Bitcoin's own virtues, because I tend to, sometimes it works, but the majority of the time it feels to me, at least, that it's coming across as kind of too intellectual. It's just not something that people think about, right? People don't think about sound money or really anything about how the monetary system works, but pointing out to them ways in which they are gradually losing sovereignty seems, in my experience, to be far more effective as at least maybe not an entire orange pill. I don't know what the most apt metaphor is here. It's like a little sprinkling of the orange pill or something, but that's a great way of getting people to start asking questions. And that's actually exactly what this guy said, but about himself, that he got into Bitcoin in 2020, 21, not for anything really to do with money, at least not at first, but because of COVID and state government shenanigans around COVID. And he didn't obviously word it this way, but in line with the question, he could feel his own sovereignty being rapidly extinguished, basically, and started asking questions about that. And that led to Bitcoin. Now he's here. So that's why it matters, I guess.
Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, so the nice thing about talking second is that I can think about what Alan just said and kind of piggyback off that a little bit. I would say sovereignty is important because sovereignty is a type of liberty. Sovereignty is a type of freedom. If you are not sovereign over something, then you don't have liberty for that thing. And again, I guess you can always turn it back to the same way that Alan just turned it there, looking at it from the other way around. What's it like to not have liberty over something? Depends on what that thing is. Do you have liberty over my car, which is currently parked in Germany? No, you have no control over that whatsoever. You have no sovereignty, no control, and you probably don't care that much that you can't do anything with my car. But what if somebody came along now and tied you down in your seat so you don't have the ability to stand up? You no longer have the freedom, the liberty to stand up. You don't have sovereignty over your own body anymore at that point. How does that feel? That feels absolutely awful. And humans don't want to feel awful. we, as simple creatures, want to feel happy, we want to feel good. So having sovereignty over your money with Bitcoin is having the liberty to use your money in whatever way you choose. And that feels good. And ultimately, that's what most humans are trying to do: avoid bad feelings and increase good feelings. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but ultimately, most actions that you take, most interactions, are because it's going to have positive effects on your own feelings in general.
Perfect. Alex, over to you.
Do I have to be the antagonist here?
Why not, sir?
Okay, I'm just going to go for it. So, I think sovereignty is a scam. So let's just come out of the gate with that. I don't think anybody's really that sovereign. Honestly, like, sovereignty in the definition term is like to do with monarchs and states. You know, we've kind of like brought it down into self-sovereignty to some degree. But we are still highly dependent on the existence of the state and all of these things. You know, we might be, we're in a country today, like we still had to fly through, we had to get our passports checked and all that sort of stuff. It's not very sovereign. So I think the discussion should be more about agency than sovereignty. I think that's more important. I think agency is the defining factor between someone who is like living and an NPC, right? And I don't know if anyone's ever read like the remnant essays that I did that pissed a lot of people off. But you know, in what I tried to describe there with the remnant essays was that most people don't want agency. They don't want sovereignty. And that's fine, because most people are most people. You know, it's the lemmings, the masses, whatever you want to call them. And you know, the thing about sovereignty is it doesn't just come with liberties. You know, liberties is sort of one side of the equation. There's no such thing as a liberty without a responsibility, right? And you know, I think one of the biggest diseases we have in modern society is that we've got people out there calling themselves freedom maximalists, and a lot of Bitcoiners, in fact, most Bitcoiners are guilty of this shit, is they're freedom maximalists, but they don't say anything about responsibility, right? Now, some of them try and live, you know, with a greater degree of responsibility, but I think responsibility is the thing that comes before freedom anyway. And responsibility is a weight, it's a burden. You know, agency is not free. Agency comes with a weight, it comes with an expectation. Sovereignty, likewise. You know, when no one is there to pick up after you, when if you make a mistake and no one is there to amend it for you, that's when you are leaning more in the direction of sovereignty or agency or responsibility or adulthood. So I think if we're going to have a discussion about, you know, why sovereignty is good, you know, it hinges around the more important discussion, which is why is agency good? And I think agency then ties into things like free will and why you're alive, why you're a human, and all of that. And I honestly don't think, this sounds cruel, but I don't think that applies to all people. I really don't think some people want agency, or I really don't think some people act with agency. Like, and we saw that during the lockdowns. You know, I spent quite a bit of time in Germany during the lockdowns, and I just saw a lot of non-agency. And you know, we see it all over the place. I mean, even I'll do one other example, like Bitcoin and the carnival bullshit. Like, that's total non-agency. Like, I see it when, you know, Bitcoiners go to a restaurant and then they look around and just make sure that they also order the steak because the guy next to them ordered the steak, and the guy next to them ordered the steak, so everybody orders fucking steak, and they don't even like it. And do you know what I do? I eat the fucking pasta, and the pizza, and the burger because it tastes better, and fuck the steak, right? So it's like, they just do it because everybody else does it. So I think, yeah, if anything, like, we need to talk about agency, and that's the little thread that I wanted to pull, so I'll just shut up.
Well, I guess then to kind of carry on with your thought process then, can we ever have sovereignty?
It's all a degree, right? Can you ever have freedom? I don't know. It's a degree of things, right? And I think those who have the capacity to carry greater responsibility should also have more sovereignty because they have more responsibility. So it's like it's a one thing comes before the other. Sovereignty is or agency is the benefit of having or taking responsibility.
It has to be earned.
Sorry?
It has to be earned.
It has to be earned, exactly. Yeah. Earned. And you can't just be given it. And that's another thing. It's like, you don't just get sovereignty. You become more sovereign by taking more agency, taking more responsibility, etc. And there's a degree to which the amount of responsibility or the amount of weight you can bear caps out. Like, when I was young in my 20s, I decided to try and run 4 businesses at once. I took on the responsibility for opening up offices everywhere. I had 100 people working for me. I was a fucking 23-year-old. I knew nothing about life. And in the end, all the businesses collapsed. I lost everything, and I had to start again from 25, and all this sort of stuff. So, like, I went beyond what my capacity to carry, or beyond my, ability to, I don't know, be sovereign at that point, or whatever you want to call it. But so these things come with a cost. Anyway,
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on exactly this thread. Before I agree with Alex, though, I just want to clarify that I do
You're not
actually
allowed to
like steak. Like, if any of you see me eating a steak, it's because I like it. It's not, I didn't look around first, although I do recognize that phenomenon. Though it is quite funny. I want to pick up on this this thread of Alex being mad at some of the rhetoric, let's say, in the Bitcoin community, to the extent such a thing even exists. Because I do agree that a lot of it is quite, I don't know what the right way to put it, sort of simplistic, naive, maybe, in terms of purely touting freedom as if there's no, well, exactly as you put it, that it has to come with a responsibility. I push it in a slightly different direction, though, not to disagree with you, just to tease us out even further. And actually, I think I can do this in such a way that it ends on a big advert for Bitcoin, which is it's our responsibility to do that as panelists. That one of the side effects of focusing so much on freedom, and maybe even more so on sovereignty, I kind of got the impression that this maybe, you can respond to this obviously, but I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth, but this maybe informed your irritation with invoking the concept of sovereignty kind of too carelessly, let's say, is that kind of language, that rhetoric around, obviously it also stems from the sovereign individual, which is itself, a kind of a metaphor that has a lot of nuance to it, and I feel a lot of people who say this haven't probably read the book, or, couldn't tell you that much about what it says. But a lot of the way that the sovereignty angle is used, and especially when freedom is wrote into it, tends to ignore, or in some cases even downplay, interactions that people have that, or rather dependencies, so social dependencies, the way people operate within social groups that are clearly restricting their freedom, right? But doing so very deliberately. It's not that they're being coerced in any way, it's that they're voluntarily giving up their freedom because they benefit from membership in the group in some other way. The way I want to spin this finally to get into to being an advert for Bitcoin is that you could, I wouldn't do it now, you could give a whole talk, write a whole book about this, about what kinds of institutions ought to have these properties and what really benefit the individuals involved, even maybe in some cases where they think they're doing it perfectly consensually, but it's actually kind of, it's toxic or whatever, it's not really benefiting them. They need to take more agency, as Alex would probably put it. The thread I want to just pull on to get to the Bitcoin advert, though, is that one of them that is probably one of the most important, let's say, or certainly for in the context of this conference, I think we probably all agree is the most important. From my perspective, I think it's most important is money. And so this is probably the main reason that I get irritated with what I picked up on as maybe Alex's irritation too about freedom maximalism, and not freedom maximalism itself, but the careless rhetoric only around emphasizing freedom, that money doesn't make sense other than as a social institution. It's exactly one of the institutions that I was, that's why I set it up this way. It's not something that you can make any coherent sense of without it's how it relates you to other people. And so the final point I wanted to get to, that I got all excited when Alex introduced all of these terms, is that what Bitcoin allows for the first time, and you can maybe talk about some elements of this with the gold standard, but Bitcoin is a new dimension of this, is in fact taking responsibility for your own money. It's enabling you to have agency rather than just I guess, passively accepting that this is an institution. So it is necessarily, to some extent, a social institution, but one that you just have no agency in and you can't opt out of. You do now finally have that choice.
Yeah, so you stole about half of what I was going to say there, so that's good. It means we're pretty much on the same page. But I was also going to extend that a little bit into looking at how Bitcoin works at a more fundamental level. You have the idea of individual nodes who are, to use that term, self-sovereign. The nodes define how they behave and they define the rules and so on. But if I run a node and I set my rules to be different to everybody else's node, I'm well within my power to do that. I can do that. But I am no longer running the same Bitcoin as everyone else. They will reject my transactions and I will reject their transactions, at which point I am unable to transact with anyone. So, as you point out there, Ellen, money is a social phenomenon. You need at least two people for money to make any sense, and for it to make any practical sense, you need a lot more than two people. And in Bitcoin, the consensus algorithm is essentially the way that we come to an agreement on what Bitcoin is and how we behave and how we interact with each other. So I view Bitcoin very much as a set of social rules rather than this more, I guess you call it, the naive, individualistic approach of the sovereign, the freedom maximalists laughing at rather than actually understanding how it behaves. That's not to say individualism isn't important. You should have the maximum amount of individual liberty to do what you want. I believe that very firmly. But maximal amount doesn't mean absolute, because you are a member of society. I can maximally choose to run my node with completely different rules to everyone else, and then I will take the consequence of that action that I am unable to trade with anyone else. I'm unable to interact with anyone else. It's a pointless thing to do. So you are a member of society, and you have to, in some ways, in order to maximize your actual freedom, you need to give up some freedoms. You need to give up the freedom to, say, I want to have a different Bitcoin consensus algorithm. I want there to be 42 million Bitcoin now instead of 21. If I choose to do that, I'm actually limiting my own freedom, despite the fact that that was a free choice that I made.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I will ask if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, in the front row here. Perfect. Here we go.
Right. I was wondering, when you were talking about sovereignty, sorry, the pronunciation is a bit hard. How do you think you explain this word to a little child? Yes, because I know that our Einstein, he said that if you understand something, you can explain it in the simplest way. So that's my question.
Yeah, I think that relates to getting rid of the word sovereignty and just thinking more about agency. And then to the kid, it's like, you can do what you want, but play with the toys. But once you make a mess, you have to clean it up. So or making them aware that there's a cost to things somehow. I don't know if anyone's got a better example, but
So, I'm not sure about you guys, but I'm a dad. I've got two kids, 13 and 10, and my entire life, even before Bitcoin existed, I subscribed to an anarchist philosophy, and that includes tearing down of hierarchies. I do not tell my kids, you do this because I said so. Ever. I tell my kids, you do this because if you want to have a positive outcome for yourself, that's the right thing to do. And I teach them through example. If they make a huge mess in their room, I'll say, you should probably clean that up. And they'll think, and they'll be like, maybe today I won't. And then when it comes time to actually, vacuum the floor or something, then some of their toys are magically disappearing because they were in the way. They can't find them anymore. So they learn that there are consequences to their actions, which are, maybe outside of their control. And that's just the way the world works. Is it fair? Not necessarily, but the world is not a fair place, and I think it's ridiculous.
It's pretty fair. It's not equal.
Yeah. The world is not always fair to you. It's definitely not always equal. And that's something which I think my kids have learned very well, and they are very capable now of making the right decisions based on me raising them that way. I'm not going to say I'm the perfect dad. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I think pretty much most dads do at some point, and I'm happy with how my kids have grown up. So I think it worked.
So, defining sovereignty, I would say something like, and as maybe not quite to a 5-year-old, but just as simply as I can come up with in maybe a political science context, is something like you are sovereign if you can enact your will without appealing to the coercive power of somebody else, and everyone that you can enact it over is you are their sovereign. And again, just to go back to how this is the word, the concept, etc., I think is kind of abused in a lot of Bitcoin rhetoric because of the book The Sovereign Individual. But again, the title of that book is intended to be evocative. The TLDR of the book in like one sentence or something is that they're predicting that due to technological shifts, one of which Bitcoin's actually a perfect example of, even though it was written well before Bitcoin. I think that's why people like it so much. But that due to technological shifts, the ability for states, who are typically like the most obvious candidate for a sovereign, to enact that kind of violence on individuals, to impose their will on individuals, will reduce, and therefore individuals will be less subject to the sovereignty of states. I don't know if that was a simple definition, but it's the simplest, at least, that I can come up with. Yeah. But I mean, I can link it to a few other things. So, Ben's comments just there that you might want to correct this. I'm not sure if you favor phrasing it this way, but I mean, your kids are clearly not sovereign, given the way that you've set up that nothing to do with the state or anything, but at least with respect to you have some sovereignty over them. But also, it sounds like you're putting a lot of thought into how to what's the best way of putting this? I don't know. Motivate their own acceptance of their own agency or something like that, to bring that distinction back again. So that's an interesting way of thinking about the application.
I actually think that falls back a lot to what Alex was saying about responsibility. I do not view myself as having sovereignty over my kids. I view myself as having a responsibility towards them, and that responsibility includes occasionally things which they're not going to like. But it's still, I view it as a responsibility, not as sovereignty over them.
That makes perfect sense. I also wanted to tie it to your the comments about the nodes, and so viewing Bitcoin from that more granular technical sense, that if you're clear on that concept of sovereignty, I think it maybe sheds some light, or it's just an interestingly different perspective on what you can and can't do within Bitcoin. So you're obviously free to just run your own fork, but nobody else has to. You are not, however, free to force anyone else to run that fork and stay in consensus. And so it does raise quite interesting issues about what aspect of sovereignty is even really relevant here, given, again, as we've all touched on this now, that you need to, I guess in a technical sense, you need to remain in consensus. In a more philosophical sense, the way I put it before, you need to acknowledge that you are part of a community, right? That this is an institution that can only function with cooperation.
Actually, if I can piggyback on that, there's a nice little idea of ownership of land. And I think most of us would agree you can own a bit of land. Yeah, you can own some land and you can do what you want on your land in general. There might be some restrictions around killing people or something. Anyone who comes onto your land, you decide to kill them, is probably frowned upon in most cases. But let's say I own a house, and around that house there are some roads. In fact, all four sides. And then Daniel here goes and buys those roads. And he says anybody who uses my roads has to pay this ridiculously high toll. Did he or did he not just limit some of my sovereignty and some of my freedoms? I didn't own those roads. I had no power over them. They just happened to be the roads that were around my house. I own my house and I'm sovereign over that house. I'm free to do whatever I want in that house. But now he owns the roads around my house. I can't even leave without paying this huge toll. Did he limit my sovereignty? Did he limit my freedom? That's where the social aspect of the whole thing comes into it. I think the point that Alex here was making is that the words are not the correct words to be using for that discussion. It muddies things and it makes things confusing if you use the wrong words to describe it. I can absolutely say that he limited my freedom to do particular things in that scenario. But should we limit his ability to do that? These are difficult social questions. How do we behave as a society towards each other? And I'm not going to propose an answer here right now. I don't think this is the right discussion for that, because that goes into 1,000 different little rabbit holes. But I think that's an interesting thing for everyone to kind of think about.
And any other questions from Rado? And this is going to Svetsky.
Don't have to have a monopoly on questions.
Well, you haven't spoken.
I'm obviously a big believer in Bitcoin and how it can change the world. But I'm also very worried about that it's not enough. Like you mentioned, not all people want to be sovereign, or not all people want to be responsible. So we know there is only a small amount of people that we need to change things. However, I want to ask this question about how do you see, like, if we are not active in trying to change, and we all know governments, the way they're currently operating, are corrupt, and that system is not sustainable, and it's going to change. The problem I have is, are we going to change it, or are we going to wait for somebody to change the system for us, and then we'll end up into a new system that's still not what we want, right? So how would you approach that, and what else do we need to do other than Bitcoin?
Very good question. I literally spent the last 2 years of my life writing a book to answer that question. So, at 5 o'clock today, I'm going to talk about this specific topic, and talk about, and basically announce for the first time the book that I've been working on. But it asked the question of, okay, what happens when Bitcoin wins? Because I think, economically speaking, Bitcoin's going to win. You can't. Fiat is just a loser, right? And it's like the thing that's going to lose in the face of Bitcoin. It just doesn't. It can't compete. It's just a matter of time. I don't know whether that's 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. At some point, Bitcoin comes out on top. The question then is, who do we become? So you've got the argument for the Bitcoin standard, and then you've got the question of, when we're on a Bitcoin standard, do we become a new parasitic political class? Do we become a bunch of Lambo driving degenerates? Or do we become men and women of virtue? And it's not clear to me that we just automatically become men and women of virtue, because you look at a lot of people who made a lot of money out of Bitcoin early on, they generally become degenerates more often than not. There is a small cohort of people that have looked to become more sovereign, more responsible, etc., etc. But I would actually argue that's more the minority than it is the majority. A lot of people, when they come into money, when they elevate their socioeconomic status in a short period of time, they generally become more political, or they generally become more parasitic. One of those sorts of things. So I spent freaking 2 years looking at this question and said, all right, what were the greatest civilizations throughout history, and what were the cultures that preceded them? Because culture is upstream of civilization. And then I said, okay, who are these cultures? What were the behaviors? What were the virtues that were central to these cultures? And I looked at the Japanese, the samurai. I looked at the West, the Faustian West, so like medieval, feudal West. I looked at the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Macedonians. I looked at all of these different cultures, and I found an overlap of virtues. And virtues are very different to values. Values are something you desire. Virtues are something you do. So virtues are more behaviors. And I created like a list of 10 virtues that are really important. To me, virtues even transcend beliefs. So you've got you can have different religions, but all of them generally respect virtues like courage, or justice, or compassion, or respect, or loyalty, or responsibility, or excellence. So I've got these things, and it's a. I guess where I'm going to as an answer to this is that it needs to be more than just Bitcoin. It needs to be our behavior, and our behavior needs to be at least oriented around these virtues or these behaviors that seem to have preceded the greatest cultures and the greatest civilizations on Earth beforehand. And I'm not saying that these are the only virtues, but I've listed 10 which have a very strong overlap between cultures that were not even connected. You look at the chivalric West and the Japanese samurai, they had very similar virtues and they were never in contact with each other. And they all emerged through a particular class, which was the warrior class, which I believe that's where you get the highest virtues, because that's the most ascendant class, and it's the one that inspires the lower classes, and it's the one that defends the higher classes. It's actually the standout one. Funny thing, an anecdote, is that in the modern world, we've actually we've diminished the importance of the warrior class, and we've turned everything more into a civilian, commercial, trade and merchant class, and that's why we're run by bankers today. There's a whole rabbit hole there which I should not get into. But anyway, my talk this afternoon is going to be a little bit about that. But thank you for bringing that up, because that is extremely important. That's the thing that we need to be thinking of next, because in many ways, like, Bitcoin will take care of itself. It's going to win. It's going to suck in more and more economic mass. It's going to do that. We need to start now inculcating or developing these virtues in ourselves and in our children, etc., because we are going to be the class of people that rule the world. I'm sorry to say that that's what's going to happen, and we need to accept that gift and the responsibility for that. And this sort of comes back to agency, sovereignty, and responsibility. It's like the duty is going to be on us to structure the world in a new way, because the fabric of civilization is going to completely change. Things, the way they operate now, the playbook for a fiat standard is lie, cheat, steal, fucking, get into politics, get into, all this sort of stuff so you can take advantage of the system. The playbook on a Bitcoin standard is going to be completely different, because it's a different framework. And my argument is that that playbook is going to require the development of these virtues.
So, I don't want to give a direct answer to the question, just because I don't think I'd get one anywhere near as good as Alex just did, and we can all go watch his talk at 5, right? Yeah, wonderful. What I do want to do, though, is just emphasize how important I think the question is, and that I would encourage people to ask this, and to, in turn, encourage others to ask it as well. In part because, I feel like, maybe I don't know about you guys, but for me at least, this is sort of turning into, this panel, as it is turning into just me whining about which Bitcoin memes I dislike the most, but one of them, honestly, is this idea. It's not really explicit. It's not a meme exactly, but it's something that I think you can infer from a lot of the way Bitcoiners talk, as treating Bitcoin as an end rather than as a means. Yeah. So to me, seemingly to Alex as well, I saw you nodding as well, but probably to everybody on this panel, it's far healthier to treat it as a means, and I guess you can still link it to, without giving an explicit answer of what behavior should you look to enact once we're on the Bitcoin standard. Alex, this is kind of shying away from giving the answer explicitly. I think in your case, so just because it's quite complicated. You're going to give a talk on it anyway. You've written a whole book on it. What I'll say on that point, though, without giving an answer, but like an appropriate way as to how you would arrive at an answer, is that what moving towards Bitcoin standard gives you is via, I link it with the previous answer too, via taking responsibility for your own money. That enables you to take responsibility for many other things in a way that previously you couldn't, because that time, if that's the way you want to think of it, that time was being stolen from you in such a way that made you have to think about money all the time, or have to think about things that are downstream of you, living within a system in which money is deeply unfair and forces you to think that way. I think the connection is, provided that you are clear on this just being a means, the connection is that the means it gives you is more time and more responsibility to think about what the end even should be in the first place. I think if you think of Bitcoin as the end, you kind of haven't got anywhere. I think the early degenerates who now have Lambos and whatever else, I don't know if they put it this way exactly, but I think to them Bitcoin was the end, or at least riches was the end. But that's not the message that we want to get across.
I'm going to agree with 95% of what you said and push back on 5%. I don't think there is an end. Society is something you do, not something that you aim for. I think anyone who says this is the end goal of society is deluding themselves and probably deluding a few people around them. Generally speaking, you can have goals, but I would actually encourage unattainable goals. And what I mean by that is, let's say if we wanted to define the scientific approach to things, we could say the goal of science is to know everything knowable. And it will never get there. It's literally impossible. There's actually even proofs that it is actually literally impossible to even get there. You've got incompleteness theorem, for example. Gödel's incompleteness theorem tells you that you can't know everything. And I think we should treat society in the same kind of way. We should have unattainable goals that are a direction to head towards. And I think that's kind of where Alex was going with the virtues. I wouldn't frame it like that, because I think virtues are often disagreed upon, as in both two people can say the same word for a virtue and then strongly disagree on what actually matches that virtue in terms of behavior. And that itself is very problematic. Actually, to give a really good example, the COVID lockdowns, one of those horrible things that I'd say most people really didn't like very much. The people who were in favor of the lockdowns actually framed it in terms of freedom. I want the freedom to not be infected by you breathing your COVID-infected breath on me. So they were in favor of freedom. And the people against the lockdowns, which includes me, by the way, just to be clear on that, wanted the freedom to not be locked in their houses. But either way, both are talking about it in terms of freedom. You don't actually, and this is true with a lot of things, you have to be really careful about how you use words because of that. People will agree on the words that you use while drastically disagreeing on the actual behaviors that lead to that. So, all respect to the whole virtues idea, but I think we need to be very careful with how we frame those things so that we can actually have more productive discussions about what do we actually need to do, rather than just, hey, we're in favor of this particular thing. Respect, for example. What does respect actually mean? Very different things to different people. Different peoples of different religions, for example. Does respecting the other person's religion mean allowing them to practice it freely in the open? What if that religion involves blood sacrifice of kittens? Are you going to allow people to slice kittens' throats on the streets of Sofia? Probably not. Or maybe you will. It depends on your own preferences. But there are going to be some people strongly against that. There's going to be some people strongly for it. So, and both of them will frame that in terms of respect. So, we need to be careful with the understanding of the behaviours, not just the high-level view.
Be careful of the virtue signalers.
Oh, yeah.
I would say. Many of those in COVID times as well, especially those that were locking themselves away for my safety. No, please come outside. Jacob.
Thank you, Dan. Guys, we're talking about the importance of self-sovereignty. I want to kind of ask a question around, the fact that anybody buying Bitcoin through a centralized exchange has to KYC themselves. At some point, every exchange can be hacked, or the governments can say, hey, we know how much you actually bought, and now is the time under this very special circumstances that we need you to pay 90% tax on that. How do you relate this to sovereignty, please?
Just because I'm holding the mic, I'll answer first, and I can give a really short answer. Avoid trading fiat for Bitcoin as much as possible and just start earning it. Earn Bitcoin, spend Bitcoin, stay out of the fiat system. Obviously, it's not entirely possible. We can't always do that. But the more we do that, the less we need to deal with all of the crap that goes around fiat.
Do you have a talk about that? You want to share?
Yeah, so tomorrow I'm giving a talk in the other room in there called Living on a Bitcoin Standard, and kind of cover the what, the why, the how. So that's tomorrow.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is obviously it is a good idea for your own sake to try to take these measures and whatever else elsewhere tomorrow. I look forward to it. Another thing you can keep in mind though is that as you do that, there's obviously lots of different ways of implementing this, but you normalize it for other people as well, which I think is super useful. And in some cases, it can be obviously quite intangible. It's just like, you happen to tell someone, family member, friend, whatever, that, oh, I'm earning in Bitcoin, and they say, oh, didn't know that was a thing. And then it can hopefully you're planting a seed that can grow from there. There could be other cases though, I wouldn't want to get too kind of bogged down in technical commercial details, whatever, but where it does still require some or other service. It's just structured in such a way that there's no KYC involved, in which case you're far more tangibly helping by, supporting that. It could be a business, but it doesn't need to be, but, just providing your, I was going to say like your liquidity, I guess. It's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but what I'm getting at is that in all of the different ways you can go about this, there are benefits beyond yourself that are maybe even more of a reason to want to do it.
Yes.
I have no idea how long this panel's going to go for, so we'll just keep going as long as we can until the plowman comes in and throws us out. So if you've got any further questions.
I've got a follow-up question.
A follow-up question. Always appreciated.
Do you envisage that at some point in the near future there will be a different price for a KYC Bitcoin versus non-KYC Bitcoin?
Good one. Maybe.
I would agree on maybe, but I'm going to lean towards probably not, just because I think there are enough people who are willing to do the hard yards to kind of make them the same. So, I personally don't treat them that differently from each other, but if, for example, somebody was to give me some heavily KYC Bitcoin, from an employer or something, and I see that they bought it from a particular exchange or something like that, I will take the work to essentially obfuscate that as much as possible, coin joins and so on. And at that point, it's clean again, or maybe you could say it's all dirty at that point, and I don't care either way. If somebody doesn't want to take my Bitcoin from me, then that's their problem more than mine.
Any further thoughts?
I usually pay a little bit more for non-KYC Bitcoin, which, if that means anything, is premium then. I guess it kind of depends on the buyer or the seller, right? So, the thing about non-KYC Bitcoin, there's no real market for it, right? Like, that just sort of happens at the edges. Like, as in, there's no market price. So, like, if you and I do a trade now, we're not broadcasting it to the world. It's on KYC. So I'm sure that, if we could somehow measure all of it, the non-KYC stuff probably goes for a slight premium. But the whole point of it is that you can't measure it, so you can't have market price for it. So,
does it increase your sovereignty?
I mean, it has some sort of positive impact, I assume, because once again, like, if we tie that back to agency. Well done, Dan. The brilliant panel moderator here, tying it back. I mean, I guess it does anything that increases your agency in any way. Seems to me that it increases your sovereignty. I don't know if anyone has a more eloquent answer, but yes.
I think it's a perfectly good answer. Yeah. Any other questions at all, guys, before we wrap this one up? Yeah.
So I had a similar question regarding we're talking about the sovereignty, right? But at the same time, the history knows periods when, for example, governments required people to turn in their gold, for instance, right? We know some countries in the world right now ban Bitcoin. That can have certain consequences on citizens, right? So how do you envision these kinds of scenarios or not envision? And how does Bitcoin help or not help in these situations? I mean, for example, if the we also know that certain corporations are getting more and more Bitcoin, etc. And at some point, let's imagine Bitcoin is banned, and everybody has to turn in their Bitcoin. So what happens? What do you think?
So to me, this is one of those societal questions. We were talking about society a bit before. There's the old meme, Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin fixes a lot of things. Bitcoin helps fix a lot of things. But on its own, Bitcoin doesn't automatically fix a bunch of stuff. We need to work on other things, and society in general is one of them. How we shape the world around us, how we interact with each other. And so personally, if I lived in a country and they banned Bitcoin, I have the ability to leave that country. I have the ability to move and to escape. Not everyone has that. There are people in places of the world where that's literally impossible. Men with guns will stop them from leaving. And what can we do about that right now? Probably nothing. The best they can do is hide their Bitcoin, not let people know they have it, and wait for a better world. But we can't solve every problem all the time, and I think that is just one of those realities that we do have to live with. But as long as we, like I was saying before, as long as we're trending in the right direction, as long as we have a goal, even if it's, especially if it's an impossible goal, that we work towards as a world. Start on your local scale, because local is what grows larger. Start on your local scale and build a better world around you, and eventually we won't have horrible men with guns trying to take people's Bitcoin away or stopping them. But in the short term at least, it's going to happen, and there's probably not a great deal we can do.
Yeah, this is once again another Bitcoin meme I don't like so much that I can rip into a little bit. That I think that situation is very much, I was going to say it's overblown, not so much in the sense that it's unlikely it would happen. I mean, it's already happened in several places, but more the link to Bitcoin in the first place and how you ought to interpret it and how you ought to think about it. I think if you just take Bitcoin out of the picture just for a second to set up the scenario, if what you're talking about is widespread confiscation of property, and in particular property that is, seen to be politically incorrect, if you want to put it that way, or adversely affects the sovereignty of the state doing the confiscation, I think you've got far bigger problems there to begin with before you even need to introduce Bitcoin. And I think the relevance of Bitcoin isn't, oh, it's so great that it's made them so mad that they would do this. It's how are you protected in a situation where something like that can happen to you in the first place. And so I see this as actually being incredibly positive. I don't see like a 6102 scenario as being negative for Bitcoin per se. It's obviously negative for the people it's happening to, but it's a property of the state doing it, not of Bitcoin itself. Bitcoin enables you to, as Ben's mentioned, obviously not perfectly, right, but quite well protect yourself from this happening. And so I don't really see that there's from the perspective of what you need to say about it for focusing it on Bitcoin, I don't really think there is that much. It's just it's a tool. It's a means, right? It's a means rather than an end. The end, I guess, being escaping tyranny in the first place.
I'll just add something to that. When you look back at the Executive Order 6102, and if something was to happen, and just to fill people in that don't understand what that was, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he signed the Executive Order 6102, which made it illegal to hoard gold. So what was he going after? The low-hanging fruit, the big companies, the big institutions. So if we were to see something similar in Bitcoin, the low-hanging fruit is Sailor and the ETFs.
Well,
right?
It's Coinbase. Sailor doesn't have any Bitcoin.
It's Coinbase, correct. It's Coinbase, or it's Gemini, or it's the ETFs. It's BlackRock and whoever else. Just keep your head down. You don't have to go crawling into the government office with your hardware wallet or do that with a dummy one and just turn around and say, well, thanks, this Bitcoin thing was nice and I'm sure it's going to be dead and nobody will be talking about it in 2 years' time, and then move country on the quiet. I see you got to have one. I think we do have to wrap it up. So yeah, Alan.
Or just in that scenario, or pull a Ben and just say, it's time locked. Sorry.
Right.
Oh well. Wish I could.
All right, guys, we will wrap it up here. But you can carry on a conversation with any of these guys. It's very easy to grab them out in the hall here. So thank you very much for listening.